2 sheriff's deputies walked up my gravel path on a Saturday morning and told me someone had reported me for running an illegal campground. I was sitting on my porch with a book and a glass of iced tea. My niece had parked her camper van near the cabin for a weekend visit, and the HOA president across the lake had called the police. Not the first time either. She'd already tried fines, building inspections, Facebook smear campaigns, and midnight fencing installations on my property. What she hadn't tried was a background check, because if she had, she would have found out that the man she went home to every night sat in my Monday morning meetings and called me sir. Her husband reported to me, and she had no idea. Stay right here, because this story has 12 months of receipts and one very satisfying ending. The cabin sits on the eastern shore of a 70-acre parcel in the foothills of western North Carolina, about an hour south of Asheville. My grandfather, Earl Davenport, bought the land in 1968 from a timber company that had logged the ridgeline and moved on. The parcel included 600 feet of frontage on Balsam Lake, a natural spring-fed body of water surrounded by hemlock, white pine, and rhododendrons so thick you'd lose a dog in it. Granddad wasn't rich. He was a Korean War vet who worked as a machinist at a paper mill in Canton. But he saved every nickel he earned, and that land was his crown jewel. He built the cabin in 1971 with his brother Hank and 2 guys from the mill. Nothing fancy, post and beam construction, tin roof, stone chimney, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs, and a view that made you forget whatever you'd been worrying about. He ran a well, wired it for basic electric, and built a dock from locust wood that still stands today. That cabin was where my father learned to fish, where I learned to swim, and where my daughter took her first steps on a plank floor that still creaks in the same 3 spots it always has. The property stayed in the family through a clean chain of title. Granddad to my father in 1993, my father to me in 2016, after his bypass surgery, when he decided he wanted the paperwork simple while he was still around to sign it. I've got the deed, the surveys, and the original timber company land patent in a fireproof box under my bed. Now here's the part that matters. In 2005, a developer named Garrett Quinn bought 120 acres on the north side of the lake and built a gated community called Ridgeview Estates, 68 homes, HOA governed, with lake views priced at a premium. The problem was, Quinn had sold those lake views without owning the lake. Balsam Lake sits on a patchwork of 3 private parcels, mine on the east, a retired couple named the Harpers on the south, and a timber trust on the west. The HOA had 0 lake frontage, 0 deeded access. The homeowners had been told there would be community lake privileges, but no access agreement had ever been signed, because Quinn never bothered to ask us. When the HOA incorporated, they elected Diane Mercer as president. Diane was a former real estate agent, a closer, not a listener. She had blonde highlights, a voice that carried across parking lots, and a deep conviction that anything she could see from her deck belonged to her. She'd been president for 4 years by the time she turned her attention to my cabin. I'm a civil engineer. I run a mid-sized firm in Asheville that does structural and environmental work. Bridges, stormwater systems, small dam projects. My team is about 40 people. One of those people, hired 2 years before any of this started, was a project manager named Kevin Mercer. He was decent at his job, quiet, competent, never caused trouble. I knew his last name was Mercer, and I knew he lived in Ridgeview Estates, but it wasn't until his wife showed up on my property with 2 deputies that I made the connection. Kevin's wife was Diane. The HOA Karen, who wanted my cabin torn down, was married to a man whose career I held in my hands. It started in April. I drove up to the cabin on a Friday afternoon for the first weekend of the season and found a letter taped to my front door. It was printed on Ridgeview Estates HOA letterhead, signed by Diane Mercer, and it informed me that my lakeside structure was in violation of the HOA's architectural standards. The letter cited 4 violations: unapproved exterior paint color, non-compliant roofing material, absence of approved landscaping, and failure to submit a property modification request. It concluded with a demand that I bring the cabin into compliance within 60 days, or face a fine of $250 per week. I read it twice. Then I folded it up, put it in my pocket, and sat in a rocking chair on the porch. A pair of mergansers were working the shallows near my dock, diving and surfacing in lazy rotation. The evening light was coming through the hemlocks at a low angle, making the water look like hammered copper. Somewhere up the hill, I could hear a woodpecker working a dead snag. And somewhere in a gated community on the other side of that hill, a woman I'd never met had decided my grandfather's cabin needed her permission to exist. I didn't respond to the letter, not because I was being strategic, not yet, but because the whole thing was so absurd it didn't feel real. My property wasn't in the HOA. It predated the subdivision by 37 years. My deed was recorded decades before Ridgeview Estates was a line on a plat map. The idea that Diane could find me for the color of my cabin was like a stranger finding you for the wallpaper in your bedroom. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. It said I had failed to respond to the first notice and that the fine had now been activated. It included a schedule of charges, $250 per week, retroactive to the date of the original letter, plus a one-time processing fee of $150. At the bottom, in bold, it said, "Failure to remit payment may result in the placement of a lien on the property." Now that got my attention, not because they could actually place a lien, they had no legal basis, but because the mere filing of a fraudulent lien would cloud my title. It would show up in a title search. It would complicate any future sale, any refinance, any transfer. It was the kind of nuisance that takes months to clear, even when you're completely in the right. I called a friend who practices real estate law in Buncombe County. Her name is Gail Fosberg. I read her the letter over the phone. She was quiet for about 10 seconds, then said, "Earl Davenport's cabin, the one on Balsam Lake?" I said yes. She said, "Garrett, that property's been in your family longer than half the roads out there. This HOA has no jurisdiction over you. None." She told me to send a written response with a copy of my deed and a demand that they cease all contact regarding compliance or fines. I wrote that letter that weekend, polite, firm, documented. I attached the deed, the 2016 survey, and a copy of the original land patent from 1968. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. The response came 3 weeks later. Not from Diane, from the HOA's attorney, a man named Craig Pullman, who ran a solo practice out of a strip mall near the Ingalls on Route 19. His letter acknowledged that my property may not fall within the HOA's platted boundaries, but argued that because my cabin was visible from Ridgeview Estates common areas and impacts the aesthetic character of the community, the HOA retained a reasonable interest in ensuring visual compatibility. Gail read that letter and actually laughed out loud. She said, "That's not a legal argument. That's a complaint with a letterhead." I filed Pullman's letter in a folder alongside the others. Then I walked down to the dock and cast a line into the water. The lake was warming up. Bass were starting to hit topwater lures near the lily pads on the north end. I caught 2 smallmouth before sunset and released both. The sky went from gold to violet to black, and the first stars came out over the ridge. I sat on the dock and thought about Granddad, who fished this same water from this same spot for 30 years. He never asked anyone's permission to be here, neither would I. By June, Diane had shifted tactics. The letters stopped. The fines stopped. Instead, she started a campaign of social pressure. The Ridgeview Estates Facebook group, 340 members, became her weapon. She posted photos of my cabin taken from the hiking trail that runs along the HOA's eastern boundary. She shot them at unflattering angles, zooming in on the tin roof, the weathered porch boards, the stack of firewood along the south wall. She captioned one, "This is what our residents see when they look toward the lake. Is this the standard we want for Ridgeview?" Another read, "An abandoned-looking shack on our lake is bringing down property values for every homeowner in this community." The comments were vicious. People who had never set foot on my property were calling it a hazard, an eyesore, a blight. One woman suggested the HOA file a nuisance complaint with the county. A man named Steve posted, "If the owner won't fix it, we should fix it for him." Another person wrote, "Tear it down and build a proper community boathouse." My cabin is not a shack. It's a solid, well-maintained post and beam structure that I spend 2 weekends a month keeping up. The roof doesn't leak. The porch is level. The chimney draws clean. But photos taken from 200 yards away through trees don't show craftsmanship. They show whatever the photographer wants them to show. I found out about the Facebook posts because Reggie Harper, the retired gentleman who owns the parcel on the South Shore with his wife Ellen, called me one evening. Reggie was 74, a former high school history teacher, and the kind of man who still called people sir and ma'am, regardless of age. He said his nephew, who lived in Ridgeview, had shown him the posts. "Garrett," he said, "this woman is running a smear campaign against your granddaddy's cabin. You need to know about it." I thanked him. I didn't join the Facebook group. I didn't post a response. I didn't knock on Diane's door. I just started taking my own photos. High-resolution shots of the cabin from every angle, with timestamps. I photographed the foundation, the structural beams, the electrical panel, the well pump, the septic inspection sticker. I shot video of the interior, the plank floors, the stone fireplace, the kitchen my father had upgraded in 2004 with butcher block counters and a proper sink. I documented everything, not for Facebook, but for the record. Then Diane did something that escalated things to a level I hadn't anticipated. She filed a complaint with the Buncombe County Building Inspections Department, alleging that my cabin was an unpermitted and potentially unsafe structure that posed a risk to public health and the environment. The complaint cited concerns about my septic system, my well water, and the structural integrity of the dock. A county inspector named Dale Watkins showed up on a Tuesday morning. He was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. He told me he'd received the complaint and was required to do a walkthrough. I invited him in, showed him everything, answered every question. He checked the septic records, current and compliant. He tested the well, clean. He walked the dock, solid. He inspected the cabin from foundation to roofline and found nothing. Before he left, he shook my hand and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Mr. Davenport, between you and me, I've done about a dozen of these HOA-triggered inspections this year. This is the cleanest property I've seen." He paused, then added, "Whoever filed this complaint has never been inside this cabin." I walked him to his truck, thanked him, and watched him drive up the gravel road. Then I sat on the porch and looked out at the lake. The water was flat and bright in the midday sun. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows. The rhododendrons along the north bank were in full bloom, white clusters thick as snowdrifts. I thought about what Dale Watkins had said. He'd called it the cleanest property he'd seen. And somewhere across the lake, a woman with a Facebook group was calling it a shack. The distance between truth and narrative had never felt wider. July 4th weekend was when Diane crossed the line from nuisance into something much more serious. I drove up to the cabin on Friday evening, planning a quiet weekend, fishing, reading, maybe grilling some steaks. When I pulled down the gravel road to the cabin, I noticed tire tracks in the mud that weren't mine. Deep tracks, wide, like a truck or an SUV had driven down to the waterline and back. I walked the property before I even went inside. That's when I found it. Someone had driven steel T-posts into the ground along the eastern boundary of my lot, 10 of them, spaced about 20 feet apart, running from the tree line down to the water's edge. Strung between the posts was orange plastic mesh fencing, the kind you see around construction sites. And stapled to 3 of the posts were laminated signs that read, "Ridgeview Estates, private community path. No unauthorized access beyond this point." They had fenced off a section of my property and posted it as theirs. I stood there for a long time, looking at those signs. The audacity of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a letter. This wasn't a Facebook post. This was a physical incursion onto my land. Someone had driven onto my property with equipment, installed fencing, and posted signage claiming ownership, all without my knowledge, my consent, or any legal authority whatsoever. I photographed everything. Every post, every sign, every tire track. I shot video with GPS coordinates and narrated the date and time. Then I called Gail. She was quiet for a long moment after I described it. Then she said, "Garrett, that's criminal trespass with property modification. That's not a civil nuisance anymore. You need to file a police report." I did. The next morning, I drove to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office and filed a detailed report. I provided photos, GPS coordinates, the HOA letters, and a timeline of every escalation. The deputy who took my statement, a young woman named Corporal Avery, was thorough and took the whole thing seriously. She told me she'd send someone out to document the scene, and that the district attorney's office would review the report. But what I didn't tell Gail, what I didn't tell anyone yet, was that I had trail cameras mounted along my property. 3 of them, motion activated, recording 24 hours a day. I'd installed them after the first letter, originally to monitor for deer and the occasional black bear. But on the night of July 2nd, at 11:47 p.m., one of those cameras captured a white Ford F-250 driving slowly down my access road with its headlights off. The truck stopped near the eastern boundary. 2 people got out. One was a man I didn't recognize, heavy-set, wearing work gloves and a ball cap. The other was a woman. The resolution wasn't perfect, but the infrared image was clear enough to see the outline of her build, her hair, and the clipboard she carried even in the dark. It was Diane. I saved the footage to 3 separate locations: a USB drive in my fireproof box, a cloud server, and an encrypted file on my work laptop. Then I printed 2 stills and added them to the folder. I didn't share the footage yet. Not with the police, not with Gail, not with anyone. Because by that point, I had started thinking 3 moves ahead. Diane didn't know about the cameras. She didn't know I had her on video. And she absolutely did not know that the man she went home to every night, the man who slept beside her, ate breakfast across from her, drove to work with her coffee order memorized, was the same man who sat in a Monday morning status meeting while I reviewed project deliverables and assigned quarterly evaluations. Kevin Mercer, project manager, my direct report, Diane's husband. I had no intention of using that fact to threaten anyone. That's not who I am. But I also wasn't going to pretend I didn't know. The Monday after the 4th of July, I went into the office early. I made my coffee, sat at my desk, and pulled up Kevin Mercer's personnel file. Not because I intended to do anything with it, I'm not that kind of boss, but because I needed to understand the full landscape of what I was dealing with. Kevin had been with the firm for 2.5 years. Solid performance reviews, no complaints. He managed a stormwater infrastructure project for the county that was running on time and under budget. He was liked by his team. In every way that mattered professionally, Kevin was a good employee. His emergency contact listed Diane Mercer. His home address was Lot 14, Ridgeview Estates, the same subdivision whose HOA was trying to dismantle my family's cabin, the same HOA his wife ran with an iron clipboard. I closed the file and looked out the window. The Asheville skyline was still wrapped in morning mist. I could see the Blue Ridge beyond it, layered in shades of gray and green, and somewhere behind those ridges was Balsam Lake, my dock, my cabin, and a row of orange fencing that Diane's crew had hammered into ground that belonged to me. I want to be clear about something. I never once considered retaliating against Kevin for his wife's actions. Kevin had nothing to do with the HOA campaign. He never mentioned it at work. He never brought it up. For all I knew, he didn't even know the full extent of what Diane was doing. Some people live with hurricanes and never realize they're in the storm until the roof peels off. But here's what that knowledge gave me. Clarity. It gave me the calm that comes from knowing something the other side doesn't. Diane was waging a war against a man she thought was just a cabin owner, some stubborn holdout she could bully into submission with letters and fines and fencing. She had no idea she was picking a fight with someone who could sit across a conference table from her husband 5 days a week and never blink. I wasn't going to use Kevin as leverage, but I also wasn't going to rush, because Diane was about to give me all the rope she needed. The following week, she called the police again. The second police call came on a Saturday in mid-July. I was at the cabin, sitting on the porch with a book and a glass of iced tea, when 2 Buncombe County deputies walked up the path. Different deputies this time. They told me they'd received a complaint from the Ridgeview Estates HOA, alleging that I was operating an unlicensed commercial campground on the lake. A campground. Because my niece and her husband had parked their camper van near the cabin the weekend before, while visiting from Charlotte. 1 vehicle, 2 people, family, and Diane had turned it into a licensing violation. The deputies were apologetic. One of them, a sergeant named Holt, told me they were required to respond to every complaint, but that he could see from the property that this wasn't a campground. He took a few photos for the file, shook my hand, and told me to have a good weekend. Before he left, he said, "If you're getting repeated complaints from the same source, you should know that filing false police reports is a misdemeanor in North Carolina." I thanked him. I filed the incident in my folder, and I started building my plan in earnest. First, I called Gail Fosberg. I told her I wanted to pursue 3 things simultaneously: a formal cease and desist against the HOA and Diane personally for trespassing, harassment, and filing false complaints, a civil claim for property damage related to the fencing and signage, and a demand for recovery of all legal costs. Gail drafted the cease and desist in 2 days. It was 13 pages. It included my deed, both surveys, the building inspector's clean report, the sheriff's reports, the trail camera footage stills, the timeline of every letter and fine, and a legal analysis concluding that the HOA had 0 jurisdiction over my property, and that Diane Mercer had committed criminal trespass on camera. Second, I filed a formal complaint with the Buncombe County Planning Board regarding the HOA's unpermitted installation of fencing and signage on private land. I included photos, GPS coordinates, and the trail camera footage. The planning department confirmed within a week that no permits had been issued and that the installation was a code violation. Third, I contacted 3 homeowners in Ridgeview Estates, people Reggie Harper knew through his nephew, who had quietly expressed doubts about the HOA's approach. They told me that the special assessments Diane had levied for lake access improvements, totaling over $20,000, had been collected without a proper vote and without any disclosure that the lake was private property. 2 of them had voted against the assessments and been overruled. 1 had filed a written objection that Diane had never acknowledged. Fourth, I asked Gail to file a FOIA request for every complaint the Ridgeview Estates HOA or any of its officers had filed with county agencies in the past 18 months. The response came back in 9 days, 14 complaints. 14. All filed by Diane Mercer, all targeting my property: septic, well water, dock safety, noise, light pollution, fire hazard, camping, unpermitted structure, environmental damage. 14 separate attempts to weaponize county agencies against a cabin that predated her subdivision by 4 decades. Fifth, and this was the part I planned most carefully, I scheduled a meeting, not with Diane, not with the HOA board, with the full Ridgeview Estates homeowner community. I rented the community room at the Buncombe County Library for a Tuesday evening in August and mailed a personally addressed invitation to every homeowner in the subdivision, 68 households. The invitation said, "You've been told a story about the lake. I'd like to show you the truth. Please come hear the other side." Gail told me the invitations were a risk. Diane would see them. She'd try to organize a counter-narrative. She'd spin it as an attack. I told Gail that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted Diane standing in that room, in front of her own homeowners, when the truth came out. I spent the next 2 weeks organizing my presentation. Deed records, survey maps, inspection reports, sheriff's reports, FOIA responses, trail camera footage, the original 1968 land patent, a photograph of my grandfather standing on the porch of the cabin in 1972, holding a stringer of trout, squinting into the sun with a smile that said everything about what that place meant to him. I was going to lay it all out, every piece, and I was going to do it calmly, clearly, and in front of every person who had ever read one of Diane's Facebook posts and believed it. The week before the community meeting, Diane launched a full counterattack. She posted a message in the Ridgeview Estates Facebook group calling the meeting a provocation by a hostile landowner and urging homeowners not to attend. She said I was attempting to undermine the community's rightful access to shared natural resources, and that attending the meeting would legitimize his baseless claims. She called me a bully. She called me a liar. She said I was trying to hold the lake hostage. Then she went further. She hired a local attorney, not Craig Pullman this time, but a more aggressive litigator named Sandra Fitch, and filed a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I was engaging in a pattern of harassment and intimidation against HOA leadership. The motion alleged that my cease and desist letter, my FOIA requests, and my invitations to the community meeting constituted a coordinated campaign of retaliation. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 4 days before the Tuesday meeting. Diane wanted the TRO in place before anyone could hear my side. Gail and I showed up at the Buncombe County Courthouse at 9 a.m. sharp. Diane was already there with Sandra Fitch, dressed in a navy blazer and pearl earrings, looking like she was heading to a board meeting at a country club. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, the way people do when they've already decided you're not worth the space you're standing in. Judge Arthur Reed presided. He was in his 60s, bald, patient, and had the kind of expression that suggested he'd heard every variety of nonsense the human species was capable of producing. Sandra Fitch presented her case. She argued that my aggressive legal tactics were designed to intimidate a volunteer community leader, and that the community meeting I'd planned was intended to publicly humiliate her client. She showed the cease and desist letter, the FOIA requests, and one of my invitations. Gail presented our response. She started with the deed, then the surveys, then the 14 county complaints, all filed by Diane, then the building inspector's clean report, then the sheriff's reports for the false campground complaint, then the trail camera footage showing Diane on my property at midnight, installing fencing, then the FOIA results showing 0 permits for any of the HOA's improvements, then a financial summary showing $20,000 in special assessments collected from homeowners for lake access the HOA had no legal right to promise. Judge Reed listened to everything without interrupting. When Gail finished, he turned to Sandra Fitch and said, "Counselor, your client filed 14 government complaints against a private property owner whose land predates the subdivision. She entered his property at night and installed unauthorized structures. She collected community funds for improvements on land she doesn't own. And now she's asking this court to silence the property owner?" He paused. "The motion for a temporary restraining order is denied." Then he did something Diane definitely didn't expect. He looked directly at her and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I would strongly encourage you to retain counsel for the purpose of defending against what I suspect will be a significant civil action. I also recommend you familiarize yourself with North Carolina General Statute 14-127, which addresses willful trespass on private land." Diane's face went rigid. Sandra Fitch whispered something in her ear. Diane stood up, clutched her handbag, and walked out of the courtroom without a word. I drove home with the windows down, the August air thick with the smell of roadside goldenrod and warm asphalt. Gail called me from her office and said, "Garrett, you don't need the community meeting. The judge just handed you everything." I told her the meeting wasn't about the legal case. The meeting was about the 68 families who had been lied to. They deserved the truth, and I was going to give it to them. The day of the hearing, back at the office, Kevin Mercer sat in the Monday status meeting like he always did. Quiet, professional, took his notes, asked a question about the stormwater project timeline. He had no idea that 4 hours earlier, a judge had told his wife to hire a defense attorney. I looked at him across the conference table and felt something I hadn't expected: sympathy. Kevin wasn't the villain in this story. He was just married to one. Tuesday evening came fast. I arrived at the Buncombe County Library community room at 6:15, 45 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. Gail was already there, setting up a projector and organizing folders at the front table. Reggie Harper arrived at 6:30 with Ellen, both of them dressed like they were going to church. Reggie shook my hand and said, "I wouldn't miss this for season tickets to the Tar Heels." By 6:45, people started filing in. Not a few, a lot. More than I'd expected. I'd sent 68 invitations. By 7 o'clock, there were over 50 people in the room. Homeowners, spouses, a few teenagers, and a reporter from the Asheville Citizen-Times who had heard about the meeting through the county courthouse filing. And then Diane walked in. She came through the back door with Sandra Fitch and 3 board members, all of them wearing matching Ridgeview Estates polo shirts, as if branding could substitute for legal standing. Diane carried her clipboard. Sandra carried a briefcase. They sat in the front row, stage left, and Diane crossed her legs and adjusted her sunglasses on top of her head, like she was settling in for a performance review she fully expected to ace. I started the presentation at 7 sharp. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't mention Diane by name until it was necessary. I started with my grandfather. I showed the photo from 1972. I showed the deed. I explained the property history, how Earl Davenport bought the land in 1968, built the cabin in 1971, and maintained it for 3 decades. I showed the chain of title, clean and unbroken, from timber company to my grandfather to my father to me. Then I showed the survey. The audience could see it plainly on the projector, my property boundary running from the ridgeline down to the water, encompassing the cabin, the dock, and 300 feet of lakefront. Ridgeview Estates sat on the other side of the line. No overlap, no shared boundary, no ambiguity. Then I showed the HOA letters, each one, in order, the compliance notices, the fines, the lien threat. I explained that my property was never part of the HOA. I explained that the fines had no legal basis. I explained that the attorney who wrote the demand letters had cited laws that didn't apply. I showed the 14 county complaints, one by one: septic, well, dock, noise, camping, fire. 14 complaints filed by the HOA president, all targeting my cabin, all coming back clean. Then I showed the trail camera footage. The room went dead silent. On the projector, in infrared clarity, there was a white Ford F250 driving down my access road at midnight. 2 people getting out, one with work gloves and a post driver, the other with a clipboard. I didn't narrate it, I just let the footage play. 12 seconds. The fencing going up, the signs being stapled, the truck driving away. I heard someone in the third row whisper, "That's her truck." Diane didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the screen like she was watching her own autopsy. Then I showed the financial records. $20,000 in special assessments collected from Ridgeview homeowners for lake access improvements. I showed the county's FOIA response, confirming 0 permits. I showed Gale's legal opinion that the assessments had been collected under false pretenses because the HOA had never had legal access to the lake. The murmuring in the room grew louder. A man in the back, one of the homeowners who had voted against the assessments, stood up and said, "We paid for something that was never ours to use? Is that what you're telling us?" I said, "That's what the records show." Diane stood up. She turned to face the room and said, loud and clear, "This man is a liar. He's trying to steal our lake access. Everything I've done has been for this community." The room erupted, not in her favor. 6 or 7 people started talking at once. A woman near the front said, "Diane, you told us the HOA owned the lake." Another said, "You took $20,000 for construction on someone else's property." A man holding a rolled-up copy of the assessment bill said, "I want my money back." Diane looked at Sandra Fitch. Sandra stood up and said the HOA had no comment at this time. They walked out together. The 3 board members in matching polos followed them, heads down, like pallbearers who had just realized the coffin was theirs. The community meeting lasted another hour after Diane left. People stayed. They asked questions. They looked at the documents. Reggie Harper stood up and told the room he'd lived on the South Shore for 22 years and had never seen anyone from the HOA ask permission to use the lake. "My wife and I signed a handshake agreement with Earl Davenport in 1999, he said. "We brought him banana bread every Christmas. That's how you get lake access in these mountains. You ask. You respect. You don't send letters." The reporter from the Citizen-Times stayed until the end. She asked me for a comment. I told her the same thing I'd told the room, that my family's property rights were clear and documented, and that the HOA had been operating on my land without permission for years. She asked if I planned to restrict lake access permanently. I said no. I said I'd always been willing to talk. I just wanted someone to ask first. The story ran the following Thursday. Front page of the local section. The headline read, "Ridgeview HOA President Accused of Trespassing, Misusing Funds After Campaign Against Lake Cabin Owner." The article included the trail camera footage stills, a summary of the court hearing, and a quote from Diane saying the situation had been mischaracterized. The comments section under the online version filled up within hours. But the real climax, the one that still gives me a quiet satisfaction every time I think about it, happened the Monday after the article was published. I was in my office at 8 in the morning, reviewing project schedules, when Kevin Mercer knocked on my door. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and a look on his face that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has recently learned something about his life that he cannot unlearn. "Mr. Davenport," he said, "can I have a minute?" I waved him in. He sat down across from my desk. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't shuffle. He looked me straight in the eye. "I read the article," he said, and I talked to Diane this weekend. I want you to know I had no idea. I didn't know about the fencing. I didn't know about the midnight trip. I didn't know about half of what she did. She told me the HOA had a legitimate claim and that you were being difficult." He paused. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to hear it from me." I looked at Kevin for a long moment. This wasn't a man covering for his wife. This was a man who had just discovered that the person he trusted most had been lying to him. Not about small things, but about who she was when the lights were off and the clipboard was out. I told Kevin 3 things. First, that I appreciated his honesty. Second, that his job was not in jeopardy. Not now, not ever, because of his wife's actions. His work stood on its own, and I had never once considered making this personal at the office. Third, that I hoped he and Diane would do the right thing going forward. He nodded. He stood up. He said, "For what it's worth, the cabin. I've seen it from the trail. It's a beautiful place. Your grandfather did good work." He walked out and closed the door behind him. I sat there for a minute, staring at the Blue Ridge through my office window, and felt something I hadn't felt in months, the weight lifting. Not because the fight was over, but because the last piece had fallen into place without me having to force it. The truth had walked into Kevin's living room the same way it had walked into that library community room, calmly, clearly, and impossible to ignore. That evening, Diane Mercer resigned as president of the Ridgeview Estates HOA. Her resignation letter, posted in the Facebook group, said she was stepping down to focus on family matters. The comments were not kind. The aftermath unfolded over the next 2 months, with a thoroughness that felt almost mechanical. The Buncombe County DA's office reviewed the sheriff's reports and the trail camera evidence. Diane was charged with misdemeanor trespass and filing false police reports. She pleaded no contest to both charges, paid a fine of $3,000, and received 12 months of unsupervised probation. The county planning board fined the HOA $4,000 for the unpermitted fencing and signage on my property. Gail Fosberg filed the civil claim we'd been building: trespass, property damage, harassment, and recovery of legal fees. The HOA's insurance carrier settled 4 months later for $41,000. Diane and Kevin were personally liable for an additional $8,000 in damages related to the midnight fencing installation. The special assessments were the bigger mess. 46 homeowners filed a formal complaint with the HOA's new board, demanding a forensic audit of all funds Diane had collected for lake improvements. The audit revealed that nearly $22,000 had been spent on projects that were never permitted, never authorized by proper vote, and carried out on land the HOA didn't own. The new board, led by a retired accountant named Patricia Owens, who had the quiet intensity of someone who finds financial fraud personally offensive, issued refund checks to every homeowner within 90 days. But here's the part I'm proudest of. After the dust settled, I invited Patricia and 2 other board members to the cabin. We sat on the porch with coffee and looked at the lake. I told them what I'd told the reporter. I wasn't interested in closing the lake. I just wanted the respect my grandfather never got from the HOA. We drafted an access agreement. Gail reviewed it. The HOA's new attorney, a competent one this time, reviewed it. The agreement granted Ridgeview residents seasonal access to a designated portion of the southern shore for fishing and kayaking. In exchange, the HOA contributed to annual dock maintenance and carried supplemental liability insurance, naming me as an additional insured. The agreement renewed every 3 years and could be terminated by either party with 60 days' notice. It was fair. It was legal. It was the kind of arrangement 2 reasonable neighbors would have reached in a 15-minute conversation if Diane had just knocked on my door and asked. Kevin Mercer stayed at the firm. He never brought up the situation again, and neither did I. His work continued to be solid. At his next annual review, I evaluated him the same way I always had, on his deliverables, his leadership, and his professionalism. I gave him a strong rating and a merit increase. He earned it. I heard through Reggie that Kevin and Diane separated that winter. I didn't ask for details, and I didn't need them. Whatever happened inside that house was theirs to sort out. I had my own healing to do. I spent that fall at the cabin more than I had in years. I replaced 3 porch boards that had started to soften. I restained the railing. I repointed the chimney where the mortar had cracked. I sat on the dock in October and watched the maples on the far shore go from green to gold to crimson in what felt like a single breath. The bass were hitting crankbaits near the drop-off. I caught a 4-pounder on a Sunday morning and held it up against the sky before letting it go. The way Granddad taught me. Wet hands, quick release, back in the water before the stress sets in. Some evenings I'd hear voices from the southern shore, families from Ridgeview, fishing or kayaking under the terms of our agreement. Kids laughing, a father teaching his daughter to cast. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the kind of sounds Granddad always wanted to hear from that water. I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, listen to those voices carry across the lake, and think about what it took to get here. Not the lawsuits or the cameras or the courtroom, just the simple act of standing still while someone else ran out of room to lie.
What stays with me isn't the trail cameras or the courtroom. It's the fact that Diane never once knocked on the door, never introduced herself to the man whose land she was trying to claim. She assumed she could overpower the truth with volume, repetition, and a clipboard full of complaints. And for a while, it almost worked. Garrett didn't win because he had more power. He won because he had more patience. He documented every letter, saved every receipt, kept trail cameras running when no one was looking. When his moment came, he didn't raise his voice, he just opened the folder. The lesson sounds simple until you try to live it. Don't react, respond. Reacting is pulling fence posts out of the ground. Responding is photographing them, following the coordinates, and walking into a courtroom with a banker's box full of truth. And here's the part that might sting. Diane didn't just lose the HOA presidencies. She lost her neighbor's trust, a judge's respect, and eventually the person sitting across the dinner table. All because she couldn't do the one thing that wouldn't make everything unnecessary. Ask. If someone has ever weaponized complaints to take what's yours, tell me in the comments. And subscribe because next week I'm covering the HOA board that secretly rerouted a private creek to fill the community pool, and the farmer upstream who had very different plans for that water.